Once the collection is measured, audited, and inventoried, staff can use the information they have gathered to generate statistics about the library. Now that our catalog data is accurate, we can trust that the statistics we report will also be accurate. Regardless of the type of library, statistics help library staff make decisions about purchasing, performance, and value. By themselves, statistics are not meant to be the definitive criterion, but rather a guide to decision making, and in conjunction with other information. This week's lecture will discuss collection management using ILS reports. We will talk about sorting data in Excel to get a full picture of how a collection is performing. We'll explore some of the most common statistics library staff use, like circulations over time, average and median age, relative use, and cost per use. We'll also talk about relative use and shelf balancing, or using statistics to place physical materials and budget for them based on their use. Here are some definitions. Statistics are facts surmised by analyzing metrics. And if you remember from last week, some examples of metrics were circulation, group metrics, and item metrics. Statistics are mathematical calculations that allow the user to make generalized conclusions about large amounts of data. Consider a library that has, over time, reported a decrease in circulation for the past few years. Without other information or additional metrics, it is impossible to make any conclusion about the meaning of this downward trending circulation statistic. Does this mean that the library is less popular than in previous years, or could it indicate that reading interest has declined? Media and politics are often accused of simplifying data and making erroneous conclusions from selected data or presenting findings without context. Essentially, statements and conclusions from a single fact can lead to incorrect conclusions. Extrapolating conclusions from a single statistic is misleading and an inappropriate use of statistics. Decision makers, regardless of whether it is a librarian figuring out what to purchase for the collection or a director and board of trustees making long-term strategic plans, they should remain skeptical about conclusions from the statistics and beware of the traps of selective data, logistical fallacies, and other misleading facts. Collection managers love using reports from the Integrated Library System, the ILS. You can run reports on all kinds of things, and I have a bullet-pointed list on the following slide with some examples of what's possible. But I want to caution you that it can be dangerous to use just ILS reports for making decision about a collection. Reports are not a substitution for physically interacting with the collection. You still have to lay your hands on the materials. Reports will not tell you about the condition of the materials, for example. They may provide hints. An item with a high total circulation count may be physically wearing out, but they're just a starting point. I use reports as a starting point that helps to build the full story of collection quality. You also can't use just one report. Putting the different reports together helps build context and tell the full story of what's really going on with the collection. Most integrated library systems can generate a variety of reports. They use specific criteria based on item records or from maybe circulation data. And each criteria becomes a way to limit those reports to make them more manageable. So no circulation prior to a specific date, or a report that lists items with publication dates before or after a certain date are pretty common. We are trying to identify items that might be in danger of being too old or just unpopular. Turnover rate is a term from business world about managing inventory. It is a ratio that tells us how often an item is purchased and replaced. So in the library world, we can use a similar measure. Turnover rate relates to the number of materials checked out relative to the size of the collection, or the number of times an item circulates within its given circulation period. So if an item goes out for 1 week, when it circulates for a week, that's the circulation rule. Maybe it goes out twice in 1 week, that's a higher turnover rate. I have a slide coming up that has more details on turnover. The rest of the reports listed on here are, somewhat self-explanatory. We have items marked missing as just a list of what items have been marked missing, or items that are extremely overdue, maybe items that were due back over a year ago or 6 months ago, or whatever criteria you set. Circulation by a call number range. What is the circulation of the 610s or the, biographies or whatever? What are the highest circulating items? You could get a report of in-house use. What items are used in-house, but maybe they don't get checked out, through regular checkout. A shelf list, we talk a lot about shelf lists, is just a list of all the items in any given collection. So keeping regular tabs on your collection through these ILS reports is really helpful in making good decisions about purchases and weeding and other parts of that collection life cycle. I think these reports are especially helpful when managing a large collection, like fiction, for example. Being able to whittle down thousands of items to a manageable size with specific criteria can be a big time saver. Again, reports are just ways to identify potential out-of-date or unpopular items. They are not the sole determining factor in your decision process. While ILS reports with specific data can help you manage the collection in specific ways, I more often use a current shelf list of a collection to make collection decisions. I like to see the collection as a whole, and with a shelf list, I can have all that collection data in one place. The last date an item was checked out, the total number of circulations, the publication dates. I could run those in 3 separate reports, or I could have all that data all together just on a shelf list. I like how everything those specialized reports would give me is available in one place by sorting the full shelf list in Excel. And by the way, if you are going to work with ILS reports in any capacity, you should be familiar with basic spreadsheet functions like sorting. You don't have to be an Excel genius, but you should understand how to sort data in Excel. There are all kinds of good tutorials online about how to do that, and we don't want to turn this into an Excel class, but know that some basic Excel knowledge will go a long way when using ILS reports, especially that sorting function. A shelf list is basically a table that can be organized and sorted in Excel. We have a title field, author, and date. In addition to each title has a field with its barcode, its call number, the date it was added to the collection, the date it was last checked out, maybe the date it was last inventoried. Each of those fields can sort your spreadsheet in a particular order. So think about the ways you can sort this shelf list. You can sort by call number, put them in call number order, which should tell you about how many items exist within each call number. You can sort by the date published, oldest to newest. This can help you pick those titles that might need updating. Additionally, you could sort by date last checked out. If it's been a long time, that title might be a candidate for weeding. And note that I said a candidate for weeding. As we said before, these reports are to help you filter some possibilities. Just because you have an old book on the shelf doesn't mean it automatically needs weeding. By continually sorting this shelf list by the different fields, you gain another piece of information about the collection, and it puts it into a different context. Think about what other sorts of the shelf, what other ways of sorting the shelf list might tell you. If you sort by title, you can probably identify duplicates. I've used this sort more often than I would have thought. One time I did a title sort and found that I had 2 copies of each item. I had 2 copies and each of them had different call numbers. So that was helpful to sort out. Once you get used to sorting things in Excel, you will almost immediately see different mistakes or, different flags, meaning something doesn't make sense. Think back to our discussion on metrics and remember the kind of anomalies you can discover with simple sorting of a spreadsheet. If you need to review how to sort a spreadsheet, like I said, go to YouTube, look for sorting a table or worksheet in Excel or Google Sheets or whatever spreadsheet program you're using. One of the problems with the use of circulation statistics is not putting them into the context of a time frame. Simply stating that something has been checked out 40 times doesn't tell us enough about that, how that title has actually performed. However, if you examine the time frame of when those 40 circulations occurred, you can make some conclusions about the item. So let's consider 2 items with 40 circulations each. Item A has 40 checkouts over the period 2006 to 2011. No checkouts occurred after 2011. Item B has 40 checkouts over the period 2019 to 2022. 80% of those circulations occurred in 2019 on the older side. Although equal in circulations, item A hasn't budged from the shelf in over a decade. Item B was more popular when it was new in 2019, but declined in checkouts ever since. Without the context of a time frame, a circulation statistic is much less useful. So what decisions can we make based on these circulation statistics? An obvious conclusion using the CircStat in the previous example is for possible weeding. Again, if you just make a weeding decision based on total number of circulations, you may conclude that an item is popular and should be retained. It has 100 circulations. It must be well used. If item A really hasn't been checked out in over a decade and all of those circulations happened 10 years ago, it's not that popular anymore, and you'll want to look at the item more closely for other weeding criteria, like last date used, circulations over time. When did those circulations happen? Meanwhile, item B circulated frequently in a short time span, and its condition may be wearing. That last date circulated statistic is equally misleading taken out of context. Librarians often run reports that list all items in a collection that have not been checked out since or before a certain date. Titles that have circulated more recently than the chosen date are not included on the list. That doesn't mean that everything that has circulated recently is a good fit for the library's collection. It could be that there is only one item available on a subject and patrons have no other choices. That's why it goes out all the time, because that's all there is. The reverse must also be considered. Items that have not circulated recently may still be a good choice for the library's collection. It may make perfect sense that they are used less often, but the library retains them for other reasons, like local relevance, primary source. It's rare, it has irreplaceable content, things like that. The bottom line is that stats without context or time frames are often misleading. Averages are very useful in collection development and communicating generalities about collection ages. To determine a collection's average age, simply average the publication dates present. Many ILS systems will do this for you, or you can do it in the spreadsheet. Just add up all the publication years and then divide by the number of records present. Most spreadsheet programs can do this in just a few clicks. Another thing to look up in those Excel tutorials we've been suggesting is how to use the average function. The value of such numbers should be used as a guide and not be considered a standard, in and of itself. The average also needs to be put into context. Before calculating the average, the data set has to be defined and corrected for anything that might give an unfair picture of a collection. Think about sorting for an average age within a Dewey range. Take the 600s, for example. Getting an average age for the collection isn't really that helpful when you consider how many different topics are within the Dewey Decimal 600s. Medical books, gardening, auto repair. All topics in the 600s will have different standards for what is considered too old or should be flagged for weeding. Realistically, each collection or even subject level holdings, such as call number ranges, should be treated individually and an average age calculated separately. Collection benchmarks are extremely helpful in putting average age into proper context for individual collections. Averages are really used to ballpark a number to make data easier to understand. A better measure is usually median age. Be careful, since average and median are terms that are often used interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. They are both ways to make an estimation about the age of a collection, but median age is a bit more precise than average. Like averaging, make sure you are comparing like items. Median age is the halfway point of publication dates in a collection, where half of the collection is older and half of the collection is newer. So use a short list for a limited piece of the collection, maybe just the medical books, the 610s. Put all of the publication dates in date order, so sort that list in order of publication date, and find the middle date. Think of something like medical or legal data, for example, having a median publication date as 1980. That means that half of that collection is older than 1980. That would really indicate time to do some updating. Cost per use is one of my main considerations when looking to buy something. A former director I once worked for purchased a big coffee table sized book about the rare birds of Hawaii. Here we were in Southeast Michigan. It was a $75 book. It was huge. It was expensive. This was 20 years ago. When I saw this book, I was cringing because at the time we could have purchased 2 audiobooks or 6 new, titles for the same price. It's not a judgment on the value of the book itself. If you're into birds from Hawaii, then you might like this title. It was beautiful. But since we lived in Michigan, I wasn't really sold that this book was wanted or needed by our community as much as a couple of audiobooks or a couple of print books that we know would have circulated really well. Granted, we had plenty of bird books that circulated well. We didn't need another one. Not surprisingly, the most popular books were about books of the Midwest, specifically the Great Lakes area. Another problem, this book was oversized. It wouldn't have fit where all the other bird books would have been, so it probably would have been ignored. I also think these giant coffee table books are more about decorating, decorating your house than stuff you actually read. I don't see a lot of people checking out oversized books. Our Circ stats show in our library that they're just not nearly as popular as the average sized books. So the bottom line, this book was checked out once. I'd be willing to bet it was, that clueless director who bought the book because she thought it was cool and not any of the bird-loving patrons. I knew when I looked at that book that there was no way we're going to get $75 worth of use out of that book. We had one use for $75. That means our cost per use was $75. For that same $75, I could have purchased quite a few things that would have been much better return on our money. So a good rule of thumb is the more expensive the item, there better be enough circulations to warrant that purchase. Think about collection development issues for electronic items, databases, ebooks, e-audiobooks. They're hugely expensive and they're not a one-off purchase like a physical book. After a certain time, the library has to repurchase the item in ebook land anyway. I'm in charge of the Overdrive collection, and currently the price of items, it's gone through the roof. Cost per use is very much a thing I pay attention to all the time. Databases like Ancestry or DataAxle, they're also expensive. Think about something like a $7,000 database only having 2 or 3 users a year. The cost per use is not great in that scenario. Most electronic materials are essentially leases. We don't own the content, and we have either a time limit or a use limit. I mentioned turnover rate briefly in a previous slide, but here's a little more detail about that. Calculating a turnover rate is useful in evaluating activity. The Library Research Service defines it best. I'm just going to quote them. Turnover rate relates the number of materials checked out relative to the size of the collection. It's the number of materials circulated divided by the number of physical materials held. Turnover rate indicates how often each item in the collection was lent out. So this measure is relevant to use of the collection. It may be useful to compare this figure to selected inputs, such as volumes held per capita, or outputs such as circulation per capita and ILLs, interlibrary loans, per 1,000 circulation. As with other statistics, you have to work with a well-defined, clean data set. Using specific groups will yield more relevant data. In particular, calculating a turnover rate on the entire collection is not that helpful. Any non-circulating items included in the total collection, like reference books, will underreport turnover since those items wouldn't circulate anyway. Should in-house uses be counted? As with other statistics discussed, there are many variations on this particular calculation. Is the time frame appropriate? Annual, monthly, and quarterly timeframes can all present different views of the same data to be utilized differently depending on the purpose. Collection turnover, specifically as a tool for collection evaluation, is best used when limited to similar items. In nonfiction, you might limit to call number ranges, and not just the 600s or the 800s, but maybe even, a 10-point section like the 610s or the 640s, the cookbooks or whatever. In many cases, narrow definitions can yield interesting information. An example could be computer materials. An entire collection of computer materials, we'll say it's 2,000 items, and of that number, only 10 items were checked out in the time frame of 1 year. The turnover of this collection would be calculated as 10 divided by 2,000, or a rate of 0.005, which translates into 0.05%. This low percentage should immediately flag someone's attention to the choice of computer materials being offered. Were the ones that were not circulating out of date? Was a particular publisher or a series more popular than others? Why did only 10 of those items circulate? The turnover statistic illustrated here is about collection use, but you can also calculate other types of turnover. Turnover measures how much something changes within a scope of time. So this can be applied to staffing, holds or requests compared to the number of copies available, turnaround time to meet interlibrary loan requests, and other library functions as well. Relative use can be a complicated statistic to use, but it can also be one of the most useful ones. So let me give you an example. The idea is that a collection making up a certain percent of total volumes should make up roughly the same percent of total circulation. Let me take this one step further with some more detail. So if the adult nonfiction 500s in the Dewey Decimal System make up 15% of total nonfiction collection, the 500s should make up close to 15% of total nonfiction circulation. You'll notice I didn't say that if the 500s make up 15% of the entire building collection or 15% of the total monthly circulation for the building, you have to put it into context for what it is. If the 500s make up 15% of the total nonfiction collection, the 500s should make up close to 15% of total nonfiction circulation. If the collection size is greater than its percent of total circulation, weeding should be considered. If the collection size is less than its percent of total circulation, you need to add more titles or allocate more budget to that collection because it's popular. The goal is to balance collection size with percent of total circulation. Again, be sure to only include related items in this statistic. Over time, collections shift the amount of space they take up. Weeded collections may end up with too much space allotted. Collections that don't require as much weeding, like art or history or even fiction, they fill up. So shelf balancing rebalances the available space with how much space is actually needed per collection. You need to calculate the average number of volumes per shelf, how many shelves per stack. A stack is one column in a row, and how many stacks there are per row. Keep in mind that this is different in different collections. Picture books are tall and skinny, while audiobooks are short and wide. You can fit more picture books comfortably on one shelf than audiobooks on a same-sized shelf. Adult art books books can be oversized, so you may have fewer shelves per stack to make space to shelve those tall books standing up. You might need more wide, shelf space between shelves in a stack. So for example, if there are 20 items per shelf in adult nonfiction 500s, then there are 5 shelves per stack. 20 times 5 is 100 books per stack. And remember that a stack is one column of a row. If there are 10 stacks in a row, that's 100 books per stack times 10 stacks in a row. That means there are 1,000 books per row. If there are 4 rows available for the collection, 4,000 books will fit. So remember that that's what is checked in, because items that are checked in don't take up space. This is not how many books you own, it's how much space you need at any given time for what is checked in. It just balances the available space. If your nonfiction goes from 0 to $9.99 in one big shelf range, you have to take into consideration how many shelves, how many stacks, and how many rows, and then take each piece of the Dewey, so the zeros, the ones, the twos, and figure out how much space each of those collections needs. Again, by the time you get to those 700s where the art books live, you may have fewer shelves, fewer stacks, whatever, per row. So balancing the available space to the collections that need that space. A few other usage statistics that can be helpful include reports of the most circulated authors and titles, or the most searched or requested titles or topics within a certain time period. Use of the library's resources, whether through the public catalog or its e-resources and databases, can indicate the types of materials which patrons are interested. This can help collection managers make decisions about extra copies, displays, program topics of interest, or even book club choices. Interlibrary loan statistics can also be helpful, while what materials are patrons requesting because they are not readily available at their home libraries. Interlibrary loan is an excellent strategy for sharing materials outside of a particular library's collection scope or philosophy, but when patrons are routinely requesting materials that clearly fall within the library's collection policy, they may be able to save money and serve more patrons by adding those materials to their collections. Collection managers can track what kinds of materials are often requested and use that information to inform their selection going forward. University of Tennessee even tracks troubleshooting tickets to make decisions on databases and other e-resource renewals. That's an interesting idea. Knowing what problems are often submitted, who submits them, and how hard they are to resolve can help make decisions about whether or not to renew those services. The more often and severe the trouble tickets, and the less responsive a vendor is at troubleshooting and resolution, the less likely the library is to renew the product or try new products by those vendors. This is a great way to use statistics seemingly unrelated to collection evaluation to do exactly that, evaluate the collection. Staffing decisions can also be made using collection statistics. For example, most libraries have fixed staffing budgets. There may be full-time staff and part-time staff, professional staff, paraprofessional staff, and non-professional staff. To schedule staff most efficiently, it's helpful for managers to have statistics on collection use. Most integrated library systems can track how many items were checked out each day, possibly even each hour of each day. Scheduling staff during the busiest times is important. For example, an academic library may need all hands on deck at the start of a new semester, but less during spring break. The various levels of staff of that academic library can be scheduled to match the ebb and flow of library use throughout a semester. At the end of a semester, when exams are over, more shelving staff may be needed to handle the influx of returned materials. At the beginning of the semester, there's probably more going out than coming in. At that time, more reference librarians might be necessary to help students find materials for their new coursework, but less shelving staff is necessary. How about a public library with an active summer reading program? More shelving and circulation staff might be needed to keep the large amounts of materials flowing quickly through the system, but professional staff may be able to concentrate more on activities like presenting programs. Close analysis of collection use will determine what parts of the collection lifecycle are the most active at any given time, and managers can schedule staff in those departments accordingly. Again, if using circulation data in conjunction with other statistics is critical. In our holistic view of the library, each department can influence behavior in other areas of the library. At times when a library has a popular program, more staff may be needed for activities like meeting room setup or cleanup afterward. More specifically, after children's story time, the youth department may need more staff available to help families find and use materials. And the circulation department may need more staff available to check out materials. Managers should track the patterns of what is happening throughout the library as a whole and anticipate staffing and collection support needs throughout the building.
For our project exercise, we'll be using a shelf list for a craft collection. So go ahead and download the companion Excel file that we have put in Module 4. This was for a shelf list for a collection that was created by combining the Dewey 600s for topics like sewing and the 700s, which is graphic arts, into a separate craft collection. And the shelf list we've provided is an edited version of one that was created and used before the pandemic. It's a little on the older side. It's not right up to date. Still completely usable for this assignment. This report was run using the Circe Dynix Symphony ILS. That's the integrated library system that created it. And it includes just over 1,800 items. And you're going to use it to make some decisions about this collection, as well as for quality control. And you'll see this same spreadsheet used in Module 5 for the assignment there. So in this example, each item is identified by an item ID, which is actually the item's barcode number. It's a 14-digit code that usually starts in our library with 33387. That's the standard prefix of our library's item barcodes. One of the other columns is publication year. When we're talking about classic titles, don't confuse the edition with the original publication date. Certain items that can be problematic are serial records. Those are issued periodically, like maybe every year a new edition comes out. The shelf list might indicate the original publication year, but the record actually includes the newest edition. So sometimes you have to look closer at details like that. The MARC entry column refers to the 245 field of the MARC record. This is not a cataloging class, so we don't need to dive too much into that. The 245 field is for the title and author. The other fields that might help you make decisions are the number of checkouts and the date last used. So for the purposes of this assignment, the date last used means the last time the item changed status. It could mean that it was checked out or returned. It could also mean that it was placed on hold for someone and they never picked it up, so it went back to the shelf. In the Circe Dynix Symphony system, that could even mean that the item was included in a display or repaired. Repair, mending, display, those are actual locations and statuses of items. So every time an item changes status, the column records the date. That's just the last date used, no matter how it was used. The current location refers to where that item is at the time of the report. Collections are always on the move, so a shelf list captures a moment in time. The date created refers to the date that the item was added into the system. So use the sorting function in Excel, which just means click on the data menu and then click on sort. To begin to contextualize the collection, start to form ideas about use and age patterns. Sort by different column headings to see which titles rise to the top of the list, and then scroll through the shelf list to see how the list reorganizes each time you sort. Do not be alarmed by an 1,800 item report. You're only going to look at the top, 10 or 20 titles probably. So you're looking to answer questions in this assignment such as, are there duplicate copies of titles? Which titles have the oldest publication dates and which have the newest? Which titles have the most circulations and which have the least? Which items have the most recent dates used and which have the oldest? Keeping in mind that this is an older shelf list, so if you see most recent date as 2020, that was actually very current at the time that this list was created. Are there any correlations between those factors? Like, for example, do the oldest items have the most circulations, or do the newest items have the most recent dates used? Look for correlations between those different factors.
Here are this week's list of links for further exploration. We mentioned QSAC, the Quality Services Audit Checklist that's used in Michigan. Wisconsin has a similar one. There's a PDF linked here for the Wisconsin Public Library Standards. IMLS has the Public Library Survey that can help you compare different areas of library service, and IMLS Search and Compare is an amazing tool to help you find which libraries to compare yourself to in different areas. That is just a super helpful tool. And then just for helpfulness, the Library Research Service has a definition of terms. Sometimes different terms, we're not clear on what they mean, so that website just gives a good list of public library terms that were used quite a bit in this lecture. So hopefully that will be helpful. Have a great week, everybody.